Hello, I'm Michael.
And I'm Eric, and let's talk tea. Today our guest is Steve Owyoung, and we've also got technical help from Eric Glass. Thanks to Eric.
Hi, Eric Glass.
um, and so yeah, how are you doing? Thanks
I'm
for being
good.
on. Thanks for
Thank
joining
you.
us. Yeah.
My pleasure.
So you are a tea historian and work on translating poetry. Is that a fair summary?
It is a fair summary. I
Okay.
love Chinese poetry, and I've been looking at the history of Chinese tea, a little bit of Korean and Japanese for many years now.
Hmm. Um, so we met this
I,
summer, and oh, go ahead. Go ahead,
I
Michael.
was I was going to say, do you have a favorite tea poem? Do you have
No,
a
I
favorite tea
don't.
poem? And is it the Seven Cups?
Actually, Seven Cups is a favorite, but it's
Uh-huh.
not particularly one of my favorites. That is to say, I have many poems that I refer to and enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
The Song of Tea being one of them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I do want to thank Eric Glass again and have him stick his head in. There he is.
Hey,
Thank you,
thanks.
Eric.
So one of the things that I was interested in talking about is just kind of continuing a conversation that we had this summer was about um, you telling me a little bit about some of the connections in the Chinese language between music and tea and art, um, things that you're working on. So.
Yes, a good source of my information on the history of tea is in Chinese painting.
Mm.
And every so often you would find that tea is being brewed underneath pine trees.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a reason for that, and it happens to be literary. And the pine tree is a favorite motif, which everyone knows as a symbol of longevity. It's
Oh,
an
okay.
auspicious symbol, but it also happens to have poetic symbolism as well.
Hmm.
And the poetic image is that of wind in the pines. That is to
Mm-hmm.
say, wind blowing through the pines and making a whispery sound.
Okay.
And this has to do with the sound that tea makes when the kettle is on the brazier.
Ah.
So when
I
you
was going to say
find
that's one
kettle,
of the boil levels, right?
exactly so,
So you know it's ready when you hear the sound of the whispering wind through
precisely,
pine trees.
precisely. And the term of that poetic image is called pine wind, sung feng.
Mm-hmm.
Songfeng.
And when you see the term sung feng,
Mm-hmm.
that not only refers to the actual poetic image of wind blowing through the pines, and not only to the brewing of tea and the sound of the kettle, but it's also an indication of the sound of the zither.
Mm.
This is the seven-string fretless zither,
It's the one that's played
horizontally.
horizontally. Okay.
Exactly. That's the one you see in all the Chinese movies,
Right.
where the fight is going on and the zitherist is playing madly, and all of a sudden his strings break because of the fast action. That's the zither.
Okay. And that's something that you also commonly hear in tea tea brewing sessions, right? You hear people playing zither along with tea, yeah?
When you go to a nice tea house,
Mm-hmm.
you often find that there are live performances of zither or other traditional Chinese musical instruments.
Mm-hmm.
But the zither is particularly favored because of its relationship to tea. when you look at Sung Dynasty paintings of the 12th century AD, oftentimes you'll find tea, pine, and zither shown in a single image, a single painting. And so there's a very, very close relationship between these three images, zither, pine, and tea.
Is that the particular zither you're talking about? Is that the Guqin?
It is the Guqin. Yes.
I've put the Songfeng characters and pinyin in the comments. So those that are curious what those are, and then I'll put the Guqin in there as well.
Very good.
Thanks. So you're saying these idyllic scenes where there's people drinking tea and there's pines and there's zither. It's not just that that's an idyllic scene. That there's a thoughtful, purposeful reason why pine trees were chosen, or there's a subject in these paintings, or
it is actually the sound that's made. The sound is very soft and lingering, very faint, and something that fades but is enduring. It's a very literary character to the sound. And that is the kind of sound that one looks for when one is boiling tea, because it indicates that the boil is correct. The heat or the temperature of the boil is correct. And it is also the sound or the kind of description that's given to the notes played on the zither.
Okay.
The timbre or their tone is sort of reticent. As you know, when you hear the zither, it's a very faint sound. And nowadays, you find that the zither is played on nylon strings. But in olden days, the strings were made of boiled silk. So the sound was even softer. And indeed, there is a poetic image where the stringless zither is actually the perfect zither and the perfect sound. No sound at all.
That's an interesting image.
The softer it is, the more perfect it is, until there's no sound.
Exactly. And there are teas that are described in exactly the same way.
Well, I was about to say your description of a sort of soft, fading but lingering, enduring sound is also, to me, like you could use that to explain sort of an ideal flavor of a tea, right? It's something that's soft, but it fades, but it lingers and it endures, and you get that aftertaste for hours afterwards.
Description of the aftertaste. Yes.
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah, because you're no longer tasting it, right? Which would be the analog of hearing the sound.
The initial plucking.
But that sense, that sense is still there, even though it's not really still there.
That's right.
Interesting.
What kind of tea do you have there?
This is Kimun Haya. I was going to go for a Phoenix Oolong and realized I didn't really have enough to keep me going through the whole show. So I was like, okay, well, I'll make a little bit more.
So are there other connections like this? Other linguistic connections between tea and other things sort of related to tea? Have you found other instances of this?
Generally speaking, it has to do with tea and how it either tastes or looks. Usually the taste is also very subtle. The look of tea is, in the Tang Dynasty, the perfect tea is pale yellow. And in the Sung Dynasty, when it was whisked tea, the perfect color was white. It was absolutely colorless. So the kind of matcha that we see now is a bright green.
Yeah.
That's quality matcha. But in the Sung Dynasty, quality tea was an absolute pure white.
How?
Froth.
How? Just so much froth that it's white?
Well, the tea actually came from a tea cake,
Uh-huh.
caked tea, which was highly processed.
Right, right.
And a lot of the chlorophyll was
And if I can
processed right out.
and if I can throw in there, the processing done then, some of those techniques we don't even know what they are anymore. They've been lost to history.
They've been
Like,
lost.
yeah, we there's documents that will say, okay, then you do the whatever stage, and we're like, okay,
But
no,
but
no
don't know
one
it, but there's no
no one
description of what
knows what
that
that
stage is.
stage, what they actually did during that stage.
Some of these teas were so rare and so costly and so time consuming. Oftentimes it would take 2 or 3 weeks just to process a caked tea.
Hmm.
And this, of course, was imperial grade,
Right.
but still a lot of thought and labor and time and money went into making these extremely rarefied teas. So rare that they lost the color of tea in the process. But that
Interesting.
was considered perfect.
That's interesting. So
Yeah,
that's again that same idea of something that's sort of faded, just barely there,
just barely there.
like the stringless zither.
Exactly.
Huh, that's
It
interesting.
looks like the wind and sounds like the
Yeah, it looks
Yes.
like the wind and sounds like the stringless zither.
It was often, it was often, the color of tea was often compared to the color of the moon,
Hmm.
Mm,
and that either pale yellow
Yeah.
or very stony, cold white.
Huh.
It was often compared to jade dew, as in the dew of the morning,
Mm-hmm.
or to jade itself.
Mm-hmm.
So it was always considered a very pale, almost colorless thing.
Hmm.
And that had to do with, again, this literary character, wherein tea was considered something that was not expansive, but rather quite subtle and reserved.
Hmm.
Lu
And
Yu in the Book of Tea says that tea is best suited to people who are virtuous and temperate.
hmm.
And you have to realize what virtuous and temperate meant in those days. But we get a sense of it even now, that one was good and upright, meritorious, and that one was moderate
Mm-hmm.
and simple in one's taste,
Hmm.
simple to the point of being extremely elegant and
Mm-hmm.
sophisticated. So it's sort of paradoxical.
that
Right.
was one of the things that kind of struck me in the Book of Tea is or the tea classic, the Chaching, that Lu Yu is like, yeah, three cups is that's more than 3 cups.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're now you're being a glutton.
Yes.
Hmm.
The 3 cups, I think I think we all have to understand that 3 cups of his tea would have put you pretty high.
Because that was like 3 bowls of tea, right? Or
That's 3 bowls of tea.
right.
Can you imagine drinking 3 bowls of matcha?
No.
Right.
I've seen people do it.
Yeah,
And,
and live to tell about it.
yeah.
But can you imagine, as in the Song of Tea, drinking 6 or 7 of exactly the same strength? So that's a
No,
Wow.
very, very
I,
no
steep
wonder
curve.
he felt himself one with the immortals. He was
yeah.
he was going on a caffeine high right there.
That's right.
I would. I think I would feel ill long before I got to the 6th cup. I'm fairly certain. Huh.
Well, it also depends on how slowly you're drinking it, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're guzzling it like a Western person drinks beverages,
Mhm.
that's a different thing than if you're slowly sipping it over the course of multiple hours.
Hmm.
You know, have a
It's very
very
likely that they were doing 3 sips, as the Japanese do now.
Hmm.
So 1, 2, 3, and then a second bowl. 1, 2, 3. That's that
Wow.
speed of it. So it is, in a way, guzzling.
It's a lot of tea.
Yeah, it's a lot
It's a
of
lot
tea.
of tea. So this idea of this sort of softness lingering, is that something that's particular to the Sung Dynasty, or does that persist in more modern art, Chinese art, or since then?
Well, the tradition goes back all the way to about the 3rd century AD. So we're talking about the 6 dynasties in terms of Chinese time. And it continues all the way through the Ming and into the Qing. So we're talking up until the early 20th century. Now the tastes, methods, and teas have all changed since those times.
Sure.
But the idea of tea persists. And the idea that tea is something subtle is still a very, very strong idea. You don't find that expressed so much in the kinds of teas that we drink now. These red teas, black teas, pu'ers, and so on.
Big flavors.
Yes, you find it more in the greens and the oolong. So it's a matter of the times. It's a matter of the development of all these new teas. And one wonders just how many teas there are now.
Oh,
even
yeah.
Just in China.
Yeah.
Well, so do you think the development of new teas or new tea types is pulling away from that idea of the idea of tea, as you put it, because some of these, I mean, pu'er is not subtle. And some of the flavored teas, even if they're not flavored in kind of the Western sense of flavored teas, but like chrysanthemum or rose pu'er or something like that. Do you think that's shifting things away from that older philosophy of tea?
It is a shift away only because the art of tea is continuing or constantly being developed. And it's because of those activities that have gone before promote the development of things to come. So the multiplicity of teas and the way in which we enjoy them by different ways of brewing, using different waters. In fact, now we can get tea from all over the world. We can get almost any water we want from all over the world. And this, of course, the modern world, the contemporary world, affects how we use, drink, and appreciate tea. But that's, as somebody very famous said, that's progress. And it may be a contradiction to say that's in line with the traditional values of tea, but I would imagine that Lu Yu himself would have thought back to the 3rd century. He, of course, is an 8th century figure. That if you had asked him whether or not his tea was a development from the 3rd century teas of the 6 dynasties, he would say, yes, of course.
Right.
We stand on the shoulders of those who went before.
So I want to throw in here one of the things that uh, I know you've written on before because I've seen it. Is Taoism, ideas in Taoism and tea. Um, like kind of like we talked about the poetic terminology, and I know there's a lot of poetic terminology in Taoism. Um, you see any special connections between those two things?
Well, when I first began to read the Cha-Jing, I went with the general assumption that the Cha-Jing and the author, Lu Yu, were both Buddhist. In other words, I fully expected to find many, many Buddhist references in the Cha-Jing. And we all know the great story about Lu Yu, who was raised in a Buddhist monastery and continued to live in a Buddhist monastery for the rest of his life. But the funny thing is that when you look for the Buddhist influence in the Cha-Jing, it is barely there. There are about 1.5 stories that relate to Buddhist use of tea, and all the rest of the stories are Taoist.
Interesting.
So it came as something of a surprise to me that the foundation for Lu Yu and the Book of Tea were totally Taoist.
So even though he grew up in a Buddhist monastery, he had Taoist underpinnings or Taoist thoughts.
Yes, and that wasn't unusual. By the 8th century, Chinese Buddhism was heavily influenced by Taoism. They, in fact, grew up together, so to speak, in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries AD.
Right.
When Buddhism, as a foreign religion, had entered China and began competing with the nativistic and native philosophical thought of Taoism. Taoism, in order to compete, began to organize well. And began to act or function as a church, as did the Buddhists. And but by the 8th century, you'll find that even Buddhist priests, monks, and abbots all had very firm underpinnings of Taoism in their thought. Because the two religions, as I mentioned, developed and formed almost in tandem, almost at the same time. Taoism, of course, is a very ancient form of religious thought, philosophical thought, predating the introduction of Buddhism.
Right. Taoism's it's not considered a revealed religion, right? Like,
and
not a guy that brought Buddhism or brought Taoism. Sorry, I mean, is there?
Well, Lao Tzu has been deified.
Okay.
And
is that fair?
Fair to Lao Tzu? I don't
know.
He's got a whole lot more duties now than he had before, so...
Yeah, they just won't let him alone. They keep dragging me back.
Can you give an example of something that was Taoist that kind of surprised you, or that around tea? Whether it surprised you or not, but
Well, one of the stories in the 7th part, where it's called Cha Shi, tea matters, or the affairs of tea, or things about tea. That's the long 7th portion of the Cha-Jing, that chapter. There's a story about a monk who does this and he does that. And at first glance, you read it and you're thinking, wow, this is a Buddhist. But as you begin to read it more closely and began to put two and two together. Turns out he's not Buddhist at all. He's a Taoist. And so there are little surprises just like that. That whole section is perhaps the most interesting part of the Book of Tea, since it gives us a running history, almost sort of shot for shot, of what events were most important to the history of tea. And Taoism was, of course, one of them. Well, there's another connection to the Zither. We all know that Shandong, the divine cultivator, was the so-called discoverer of tea.
This
and
is
so we hear this
the story where the leaf floated into
his kettle, and lo and behold, he found something good, and then spread it among his people. But it turns out that his connection to cultivation and plants and to the mulberry bush has to do with the production of silk. He was the inventor of silk.
Oh, really?
And because he was the inventor of silk, he became the discoverer or inventor of the zither.
Oh,
so
because there were silk strings.
Yes. So you have this single deity connected to both tea and the zither. And that's really quite extraordinary.
That's
yeah. That's
so the zither wouldn't have been possible without silk, and tea obviously wouldn't have been possible without that tea leaf floating into his cup.
Yes. So Shandong, who is a nativistic deity, one hesitates to call him a Taoist deity, but he is of such an age and antiquity that he is an apocryphal figure, and most of the apocryphy is Taoist.
Okay.
Or what we now call group as Taoist or whatever.
Yes. I'm sure there's some Taoists out there who would just like to come and punch me, but it's not.
Well, when I was in Taiwan, a friend, I was like, well, how do you know? Like, we'd be going along and we'd see a temple, and she's like, oh, that's Taoist or that's Buddhist or whatever, and I was like, how do you how do you tell the difference? And she's like, if there's a Buddha in it, it's Buddhist. If not, it's Taoist. Taoist. She saw it as essentially Taoist was anything that was not Buddhist.
Yes.
Right? It was just kind of a catchphrase for all of the other stuff.
Right. Well, there's a very popular image of contemporary peoples in East Asia. In the Far East, it's said that when people are just starting out, they're Confucian. And when they retire, they're Taoists. And just as they're about to die, they become Buddhists. So you have a trinity of religions, all in a single person, and all in a single lifetime.
Interesting.
Excellent. Well, this has been really fascinating, but I'm noticing that we're running out of time. For those that are viewing right now, viewing it live, we're going to have the regularly scheduled tea salon here at the Tea Geek page on Google+. So if you want to join, Steve will be there. Any last questions or comments that you guys want to throw in there?
No, I just thank you so much for joining us. I think it was really interesting, and thanks again to Eric Glass for technical assistance.
Thank you, Eric.
And it was great talking to you again.
Good to see you both.
All right. Well, we'll see you in the live viewers, which we've had a handful of here at the Tea Salon in just a moment. Otherwise, see you next time.
Until next time, drink tea, think tea, and talk tea.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.